But a strange feeling to be falling into something at the same time as gaining knowledge of a completely different person from another world. The knowledge was strangely intertwined, combined and combined in the mind, giving rise to a different personality. And this new personality had quite interesting personal characteristics, inspired, among other things, by the fact that the rules for him were different. And the basic rule was that you had to die not by your own hand and as quickly as possible. The emperor of his own reality doesn't sound appealing, and how can there be a problem with running into death? Thinking about his future greatness in his own world, the boy did not notice how a man approached him. The information about this world, supplemented by the knowledge of the historical editor, came to mind. The era was not easy. The weakness of the central government concentrated in the imperial hands led to a significant strengthening of local princes. And in fact, it did not matter who sat on the imperial throne. Even a genius or a talentless imperial power was not enough. From generation to generation, through servants and blackmail, local princely families gradually gnawed away power and land in the empire. Moreover, they were helped in this by mystical immortals who were already pursuing their own goals and desires. And today was the next part of this state drama, where the emperor had to lose another piece of land and power. As usual, high words were used to hide banal blackmail based on the military weakness of the empire. The young Emperor Ju clearly disagreed with this state of affairs, although he was unable to resist it. In response to this rhetorical question, the man looked at the emperor with cold contempt in his eyes. The emperor had not yet refused, but he was already explaining why the proposal was a bad idea that would only lead to suffering. The man repeated the emperor's words with surprise and contempt, as neither people nor ministers mattered to him. And to the chorus of his people, he hypocritically declared that his will is the will of the people and ministers. The boy watched this in sympathy with the emperor, who wanted to try but could not do anything himself. The situation for the emperor was strange. Being a good block was ethically correct, but would have led to a quick demise. The outraged emperor took out a scroll with reports on the behavior and customs of the immortals, and they were not in their favor. It turns out that the emperor really thought about the people and their prosperity, while the Li family only thought about their own pockets and comfort. The official standing next to the boy was clearly filled with justified anger. But what is justice in a world of power? The guy had already thought that he could achieve his goal beautifully and was also covered with a heroic glow. A stout man with a stern look took a few steps forward and began to draw his sword, richly decorated with gold. As he approached the emperor, he swung his sword, which began to burn with a strange magical fire, and struck the table on which the scroll was lying. He looked at the emperor with a fierce gaze and a wild smile, clearly boasting of his power and enjoying the imperial helplessness. The emperor did not expect such insolent behavior right in his throne room, and he did not even find the words to besiege Meng. And as if mocking, the man ceremoniously folded his arms and asked him to confirm his title, but his tone was reminiscent of a highwayman. And as if to continue his mockery, he handed the emperor a scroll in a gilded case, which obviously contained the order for his appointment. And as if the matter had already been resolved, Meng called the seal-bearer to approve this brazen document. The young man's voice, full of righteous anger, sounded in the throne room like a bolt from the blue. The young man shouted at Mega, at his officials and everyone else standing around, accusing them of rebelling against the emperor, and he was right. No one expected such behavior from such an insignificant official who actually had no power or strength. Even those who were on the emperor's side, and the emperor himself, who had not expected this, looked on in amazement as the young man reprimanded the officials like boys. The emperor, with his eyes wide open and his mouth equally wide open, could not believe his eyes that this was all that was possible in his rotten empire. There were tears in the emperor's eyes from a sense of gratitude that there was a man who was faithful to the ideals of the empire. But the officials quickly recovered from the shock and began to attack the guy, accusing him of unworthy behavior. A venerable grey-haired man approached the boy with a threatening and unperturbed look. The grey-haired Shang, the Minister of Finance, looked as if he were forced to talk to a nasty, slimy reptile. When answering the young man's question, the old man expected him to stare at him and realize how wrong he was. But instead, the young man attacked him with a bunch of suspicions about the old man's intellectual abilities and great doubt about their existence. The young man wrapped up his accusations and insults in such a cool way that the old man was speechless, and all he could do now was blink his eyes. And the guy seemed to only get more and more agitated, saying all kinds of insults to the Minister of Finance. It was scary to look at my grandfather. He had never in his life listened to such a pile of dirt against him, and the worst part was that the boy's words were true. Finally, the old man, unable to withstand such pressure, fainted and fell into the arms of his supporters, and the boy exhaled, preparing for the next round. Indeed, this was far from the end of today's showdown, and the familiar gilded sword left its sheath with a familiar shuffle. Meng stood in front of him with a sword, angry as hell, and began to threaten the boy's life. The guy was not afraid of anything, remembering his true mission, and therefore spoke the truth boldly and loudly. He was not afraid of death in the slightest, and stood between Meng and the emperor calmly and unmoved, and this made an impression. The guy was literally asking to be stabbed with a sword, provoking him with every word he said. It was a really exciting feeling to stand alone against a whole crowd defending justice and the law. Those of the junior officials who watched this felt ashamed and wanted to imitate the bold, desperate behavior. This behavior was indeed suicidal, as telling the truth in a court rife with intrigue and backroom games was a one-way ticket. He was the personification of the law, and seeing a man so desperately defending those very ideals made me feel both ashamed and inspired. The emperor panicked and tried to think of a way to save the desperate young man from being killed right in front of the throne. Meng's sword was already pointed at the boy's face, and the angry man had to make only one move to take the boy's life. But the boy was not afraid. He just smiled at the danger as if it were the highest reward for him. Although this was the case, no one knew about it, and therefore his behavior was shocking because everyone values their life as the highest value. I didn't understand what was wrong with him, but he stood there without making a move and continued to watch the guy's unmoving face. He didn't understand this behavior and tried to convey to the boy that his bravado would lead to nothing anyway. But the man's words had no effect. He just kept smiling and then decided to remind him of something important in his opinion. Full of inner strength, the words sounded in the throne room, forcing everyone present to think about them. After finishing his short speech, the guy contemplated the effect of his words with a satisfied face. But a strange thing happened. His words seemed to still sound in the hall, although in fact there was a deathly silence. In some strange, seemingly magical way, these words echoed on like distant thunder. Spoken once by a teacher and heard at this critical moment, they acquired a mystical power and seemed to resonate with every grain of sand in the empire. Amazed people heard this voice, not understanding where it came from, but feeling the power of these magical words. And in the most remote corners of the empire, scribes were overwhelmed by an unexpected sense of strength and harmony, and an understanding of how the world works and where to look for justice and order in it. The people in the throne room began to discuss what they had heard, words that each of them knew but were afraid to say in order not to provoke the wrath of the immortals. Due to their own fears and ambitions, everyone has forgotten what loyalty to justice and the law are and why they are needed. One of the men in the audience watched the reaction of the officials, clearly fearing what the revived teachings of Confucius might entail. Meanwhile, the boy was waiting for Meng to strike a fatal blow with his sword to be reborn into an omnipotent entity. But instead, the man began to laugh and praise the boy for his good words and brave behavior, and it was obvious that there would be no blow. After saying this pompous phrase, Meng abruptly sheathed his sword, upsetting the boy who was already hoping for a heroic ending. Paying tribute to the boy's courage, the man bowed and offered to join him. It was really tempting. The emperor could give the official almost nothing, and Meng could shower him with gold and honor. But the emperor had no idea what was going on in the boy's mind. He did not understand how such a powerful man could calmly withstand such insults. He decided not to stop on the way to his goal and tried to shout disrespectfully at Meng again, hoping to make him angry. But he didn't seem to notice the disrespectful attitude and just answered the guy's words as if he wasn't shouting at him like a boy. One way or another, the boy continued to declare his loyalty to the emperor despite the promises of the mini-king. He explains his behavior by his gratitude for the fact that the emperor's mercy allowed him to become who he is despite who he was born. The poetry of the boy's words again filled the emperor's heart with hope and courage. But at the same time, the emperor realized that such devotion could not be one-sided and promised himself to do everything he could for the boy. Meng, meanwhile, had lost all interest in the boy, in the emperor, and in the demand that had brought him to the throne room today. The guy did not understand how it was possible, why he was still alive, and why these ambitious people who put themselves above the law did nothing to him. Meanwhile, another man came closer and began threatening Yan with death for his insolence, and the boy's hopes for imminent death were revived. This man was certainly not joking when he ordered him to immediately hand over the imperial seal under threat of death. He didn't pull out his sword or dagger, just swung a soft brush in the boy's direction and managed to cut off a strand of his hair and wound his cheek. The officials who were on Jan's side turned away to avoid seeing the tragedy of his inevitable death because the immortal did not throw words to the wind. Trying to stop the violence, the emperor shouted at the immortal not to touch the boy. And John, not paying attention to the scratch or the words of the impudent man, just continued to provoke him, looking boldly into his face. He came up to the immortal close to him and began to insult him in the most disrespectful and insolent way possible. He continued to tell the truth in the most offensive way possible, hoping that the immortal would lose his temper and kill him right there. The voices of the officials who sided with the boy sounded louder and bolder as they echoed through the hall. The man could no longer stand such insolence and mockery of his authority and power. His eyes flashed with rage, and gathering his strength in his hand, he began a movement that was to end the life of the insolent man by showing everyone who really has power in this world. The guy was smiling. He had finally achieved his goal and would die heroically to be blocked by an omnipotent being. The thought flashed through his mind that from the force that the immortal puts into a blow, he would die without feeling pain. As if in slow motion, the boy watched the immortal's energy-filled fingers bring him closer to death. But at the last moment, a spherical barrier formed around John and repelled the deadly attack. Neither the boy nor the immortal could understand what had happened, and both looked puzzled, though for different reasons. The Emperor, holding a strange-looking shining bowl in his hand, began to protest against such behavior against his subordinates. There were surprised exclamations from people who recognized the magic of the imperial artifact Ju in the barrier. It was the last breath of magic of this magical object, and now it has turned into an ordinary golden bowl. Wasting such wealth as the power of Ju's ancestors' artifact on an unknown petty official seemed like blasphemy. But the Emperor looked resolute and obviously did not regret his decision. In fact, Jan had a low opinion of the Empire and the Emperor as such, so he was extremely surprised by the Lord's words. An emperor willing to sacrifice himself for a subordinate was already a strong symbol that left a mark on the hearts of officials. But Jan did not need this. He wanted to die as soon as possible and as brightly as possible, and the emperor's actions only hindered him. In his mind, the whole scene began to take on the qualities of some strange black humor that was not part of his plans. He wanted to argue with the emperor, but the latter's determination to defend his subordinate was beyond him. This was out of the question. Jan was getting further and further away from incarnation and bringing more and more suffering that he did not want. The immortal, meanwhile, was also bored with this comedy, and since he was not in any way inclined to kill the emperor, he retreated, although he left the conditions. And with a final, not-so-camouflaged threat, the immortal turned his back on the emperor and left. This behavior was brazen and unthreatening, and the emperor even stepped forward to protest. Suddenly, he stopped talking in mid-sentence and went limp like a balloon that had been deflated. And he began to fall backwards into the arms of John, who was shocked by this surprise. A second later, the emperor opened his eyes and seemed to the boy too cute and attractive. John froze, not understanding the feelings that suddenly took over his entire being. But a second later, he realized and abruptly pulled away from the emperor, causing him surprise and bewilderment. He looked at his hands, shocked by his realization that his body's preferences did not match his own. He was afraid to even think about this possibility and now looked at this completely different world with fear. He began to look closely at the male officials standing in the hall, trying to understand what he was feeling by looking at them. But in reality, there were no changes, and he was relieved to realize that he still preferred women as he had before. With all these worries about orientation, he completely forgot why he started all these performances, and he rushed to attack the immortal, brazenly pointing a finger in his face and explaining that his life is worthless compared to such an important issue. It seemed that his own ideas were forming in his head as if inspired by an invisible spirit. He went on and on as if he were obsessed with these ominous but beautiful words. Suddenly, I felt and saw something strange, or rather, a shining coming right out of him. Despite the drama that was taking place in the throne room of the imperial palace, everything looked calm from the outside. But the next moment, two giant pillars of light stretched up to the sky from the roof above the throne room. Pillars of light attracted people's attention for a gigantic distance around the palace. People began to discuss what they had seen and came to the unequivocal conclusion that this was a sign of the beginning of a new era of Confucianism. Everyone was curious about what happened in the emperor's palace and who caused these amazing pillars of light. Who personified the spirits of the two wisest prime ministers of this era? And again, the words full of wisdom resounded in the hearts of the people who saw this strange light resonate with each of them. Meanwhile, Ian stood at the pillars of light that blinded everyone around him, and he didn't understand how this could happen to him. He stared at his shining palm in shock, feeling the strange power that had appeared in him, and realized that the immortal would not kill him today. In his last attempt, he attacked him like a madman, asking him directly to end his life. But he just stood back in shock, frightened by what he saw. The guy seemed to become a giant with an immortal mountain hanging over him. But the man got over his feelings and, realizing the danger such a person could pose to his clan, prepared to make a decisive strike. Gathering all the strength he could muster in one point, he directed deadly energy at the boy. I was a little confused by the sudden changes that the immortal was demonstrating and only noticed the blow at the last moment. A bright flash blinded everyone in the throne room. The immortal's blow caused a real explosion that threw him back with a terrible force. On the way to the flight, the man's back met one of the massive columns of the hall. The encounter with this column was not in vain. The immortal lost consciousness and quietly fell to the floor. It came as a shock to everyone present because no one had ever seen an immortal defeat before, and there was no doubt that it was a defeat. Not yet realizing what had happened, John asked the man to get up and kill him, but he showed no signs of life. The man finally came to his senses and looked at the boy with horror, not even trying to show aggression. Suddenly, he let out a whole fountain of blood from his mouth, which scared the guy, who could not believe that it was his handiwork. The man fell dead, and there was no doubt about it. And there was talk of what this death might bring in the future. Meng came up to Yang and ritually bowed before him, although the boy did not even seem to notice. Meng thought about the other people who had been watching everything that had happened here and wondered what they would tell their masters. And he hurried to turn away from John, putting a timeless expression on his face. Under the astonished eyes of the emperor and other courtiers, the applicants for the new title hurried to the exit of the throne room. The emperor returned to Yang and hastened to assure him that the supreme clan would not harm him, not understanding his true motivations. However, he bowed low to the emperor anyway, assuring him that it was of no importance to him and not worthy of the imperial attention. Finally, this strange meeting in the throne room was over, and all those present hurried to tell their friends and colleagues about what they had seen. An official approached the upset boy and brought him here with a cheerful voice, drawing his attention to himself. Ignoring John's gloomy appearance, the official began to praise his behavior, and he was happy for this wonderful turn of events that brought the guy to a career height that was unattainable in the morning. He kept saying this, but I needed only one thing now, a quiet place to think. Having finally brought his consciousness to relative calm, he was able to understand the nature of his new power, which other officials called scientific. A strange mystical energy protected him, making it even more difficult for him to die as soon as possible. This fact depressed him because in the morning his plan, which had seemed so simple to execute, turned out to be completely different in practice. Outside, the same official was waiting for him, and he found a corner for him in the side halls. Ian was surprised at this man's dedication, also remembering other people's knowledge of officials. But he was sincerely happy to help the guy, not least because of the way he showed himself today. John felt very skeptical when he heard the man call him a hero because he did not consider himself one. He wondered how it could all come back to the future as they approached the huge gate. It was strange. He didn't feel like a hero for a minute, but he understood why his interlocutor had such an impression of me. But when he opened the gate, he lost all thought and was shocked by what he saw behind it. And there was a whole crowd of people waiting for him who began to shout his name as soon as he appeared in their sight. They shouted words of admiration at him without daring to approach him, as if he was some kind of pop star. John was confused by this reception, although he could not help but admit that this meeting made him happy. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, the conversation was becoming much more cynical and practical. The emperor wanted to protect the boy who had so bravely rushed to his defense today. The interlocutor agreed with the emperor, but perceived today's events as a sign to take action. The cherished dream of reviving the power of the imperial Zhou dynasty was becoming more and more real. Chancellor Li, who was peacefully drinking tea with the emperor, saw this young man as playing an important role in this revival. The situation was indeed difficult. It seemed impossible to save Jan's life, but the Chancellor saw two ways to do so. The Emperor did not see any practical sense in the first option because the boy seemed too clean for that. However, there was still a second option for the Chancellor, which was that no one dared to attack the boy. Chancellor Li looked carefully at the Emperor and with his question pushed his mind to the obvious answer. The Emperor did not disappoint the old man's expectations by instantly finding the answer in the Garden of the Sages. While sipping tea, Li described several problems with the garden, but it seems he already had a plan to overcome them. The sage's words miraculously coincided with the behavior that Jan demonstrated in the throne room, so precisely that it was even scary. The emperor opened his mouth from the sudden realization that such a strange coincidence was not accidental. The chancellor confirmed the emperor's thoughts in his own words and was as full of joyful expectations as he was. Nevertheless, the Garden of the Sages was a really dangerous place, and the emperor did not want to do John a disservice by sending him there. However, one way or another, the chancellor saw no other way to ensure the boy's safety from the attacks of the immortal sect. The old man saw the emperor's concern on his face and hastened to calm his fears about the boy's fate. Nevertheless, the concern was real and not in vain, and old Li thought about how to ensure security. Only a few tests will be able to tell at least approximately whether Jian will be ready for the trials of the garden. The emperor idealized the boy in many ways, but the wisdom of the old chancellor gently guided the ruler's thoughts in a safe direction. The chancellor has lived long enough to know how fluid and changeable people are, and how quickly their ideals can change under the influence of temptation. He knew that imperfect people lived in a far from perfect world, but there were no other options, so he had to act based on reality, not fantasy. Therefore, Chancellor Li proposed a difficult and tough test for the young man, namely, the test of a woman. The emperor pondered the words of the old advisor as he walked to his chambers. Finally, the day was over, and he could let the servants go and throw off the burden of the imperial crown. Left alone, the emperor carefully examined his reflection in a huge mirror. Suddenly, a woman's voice was heard behind him, belonging to a person whose identity was hidden by a mask. The woman was obviously aware of both the events and the emperor's negotiations, and was obviously close to him since she allowed herself to doubt his conclusions. When the woman took off the emperor's jade pendant, his figure was enveloped in radiance and lightning of magical energy. In this strange energy glow, the figure of the emperor began to change, taking on completely different forms. Or to be more precise, female forms that were hidden by the magic of the talisman. For Yan, the morning was full of reflections and worries about his plans and the people he wanted to influence. He lazily lounged in the garden, thinking about how he had imagined this world completely wrong when he first entered it. I also reflected on the desires, hopes, and fears of the people I met here. At first, he perceived them as an entourage, not thinking about their lives or their fates. But he also did not like the events of yesterday, which made him a hero because he felt like a passerby. Jan grabbed onto this thought like a life preserver. He had a clear purpose in this world, and the fates of passers-by were just the fates of passers-by. And he reminded himself once again what he had to do, namely die by someone else's hand as soon as possible. With these thoughts in mind, he opened the gates of his home, hoping to find enough dangerous adventures outside. But despite the early hour, his fans, whom he had not expected to see, had already gathered outside, and he resolutely went back home to avoid seeing this crowd of people who had placed their hopes in him. His servant reported that people had gathered there at dawn and had been waiting for him all this time. He also pointed to a whole basket of letters that had arrived in one day, and their origin was also easy to trace. Meanwhile, outside, servants in identical uniforms were pushing back the crowd so that their master could pass without obstacles. The man was looking at the gate of John's residence, drawing conclusions about his identity in advance. John watched this action through a crack in the wall until an official voice announced the identity of the detainee. However, the guy did not want to meet anyone, regardless of rank or position. But his servant, who had heard the master talking to himself, shared with him information about the terrible gossip that was circulating around the guest. For John, this was more than enough to invite such a distinguished guest inside. Full of joyful expectations, the boy opened the gate and cheerfully invited the son of the leftist chancellor to visit. They sat down in the living room, where Ian poured tea for his guest and inquired about the purpose of his visit. Luis took his time with the answer, evaluating the tea and the dishes it was poured into, as this could say a lot about the host. After a short pause, the guest decided to get straight to the point and did so in the most direct and relaxed way possible. Any reaction would have been appropriate concern and fear of denial, but instead, Jan expressed joy, which surprised the man. Realizing the inappropriateness of his reaction, he tried to change the subject while Luis was wiping up the tea he had choked on when he saw the young man's reaction. Ian carefully brought more hot tea when the guest finished sharing the information he had. The news caused the young man to experience a rather painful excitement associated with a great danger to his own life. Having interpreted what he saw in his own way, Luis was imbued with respect for the courage demonstrated by the young man. The next news should have pleased Jan, as he would have safe time to prepare for the attack anyway. But the guy seemed upset instead, and his guest could not understand what was driving this strange behavior. Meanwhile, Ian thought that if his existing enemies were in no hurry, it was never too late to make new ones. For Luis, the conversation finally went down a familiar path. The guy obviously wanted to find powerful allies to defend himself. He understood that. He suggested not to delay these actions and to go right now to one of the places where you can meet such people. As they walked, Ian had a great opportunity to see the city with his own eyes and not in someone else's memories. The place they came to did not look like a dangerous place full of strong and desperate potential killers of Jan. Indeed, in fact, it was a natural brothel with a bunch of girls and their guests who were not in a murderous mood. Ian did not understand how a brothel could help him fulfill his dream and was beginning to regret the time he had lost in this walk. But what Louise whispered in his ear revived his hope, and if he didn't dare to speak up, maybe John had a chance. Still, it was only a brothel, and the guy did not really believe what his companion was saying. Inside, there were people everywhere, accompanied by courtesans, against the backdrop of richly decorated walls, partitions, carpets, and everything around them was buried in luxury. One of the women approached them and politely greeted Lord Lewis, who immediately asked for a room and a table. 8 beautiful courtesans who dazzled everyone with their beauty ended their performance to the cheers of the crowd. These were the very 8 courtesans Louise had told Louise about, and Grace's beauty really impressed even the 21st century's spoiled Jan. The boys watched
The show from a private room, and Louise's story suggests that this place was indeed an important center of social life. But John still had his own goal, and his attention was focused on other things, so he asked about the top floor in this place. And the guy confirmed his guesses, saying that it was there that the person from whom we could expect danger was there. He talked about the most influential woman in the place in a dreamy tone. He himself was clearly interested in the attention of such an unusual and influential courtesan. Still, John did not form a picture in his mind because a courtesan who did not behave like a courtesan sounded very strange to him. This was the source of the danger that Louise was talking about, and he went on to this deadly part of his story with a somewhat grim face. The connections with the Imperial Palace and with some high-ranking person from it could really become a protection for such a woman from almost anything. A jealous high-ranking official, infatuated with a courtesan with a lot of connections and power, could indeed be a way for John to commit suicide. Meanwhile, the subject of their conversation had plans for the boy herself, or rather, for arranging his exam. This woman was indeed beautiful in her own right, but her clothes and precious surroundings miraculously emphasized her beauty even more. On stage, 8 beautiful courtesans basked in the glory of their own glory after their performance. The men went out to the hall, and on the way, Louise told John about ways to attract the attention of the 8 oirons. Meanwhile, one of the brothel workers loudly asked everyone to calm down and listen to the announcement from her owner. The crowd was clearly animated by this and began to discuss who could have been the person who had attracted the attention of the hostess. Meanwhile, the girl looked at the letter in her hands and said the name of the lucky man, who turned out to be Jan. The guy was shocked by this turn of events, and he was not used to such attention to his personality from people around him. But one way or another, this is exactly why he came here. So despite the talk behind his back, he celebrated his good fortune. His thoughts were interrupted by a man in an ivory-colored robe who managed to praise and insult Jan at the same time. This man clearly challenged Jan to a duel, even though the duel was already poetic. This one knew his worth and was sure that there was no better poet in modern times than him. So he looked at the guy defiantly. With a slow step, he approached him, savoring the tension in the air around them. But to his surprise, Ian didn't express any concern about the challenge and calmly accepted it, which was not surprising since the guy had aces up his sleeve. Contestants of different levels and talents wrote their works at tables set up in a spacious hall under the close supervision of the jury. Kai and Young sat at their desks thinking about each of their works, with blank sheets of paper in front of them to write them down on. The judges were evaluating the poems of other contestants out loud, which did not add to the atmosphere of calm necessary for creativity. It was too boring, too poor a style. Too many repetitions were constantly heard in the hall, and the dying was in full swing. Occasionally, however, praise was heard, but it was still the exception. Kai was the best poet in the exams, and did not want to lose this title. This ambition helped the man to reach new levels of his skills in many ways. When he finally began to write, his figure lit up with the energy of a scholarly scribe. He was calm and confident. Already, by the level of energy he radiated, one could tell that the new poem was beautiful and worthy of being a legacy. But he wanted more and continued with even more enthusiasm, claiming a higher level. The judge was fascinated by the work of a true poet and could not take his eyes off it. However, when he finally finished, he had the disappointed look of a man who was almost at his goal but did not reach it. He quietly put down the brush, realizing that he still hadn't reached the level he hoped to conquer today. He exhaled heavily, thinking about how much more he had to learn and hone himself to get the desired result. But eventually, he was distracted from his thoughts by paying attention to the enemy, who was drinking tea with a distracted look. The guy laughed and apologized for the delay, looking as if it was not a poetry exam, but a dart-throwing contest in a bar. And he rolled up his sleeves and approached a blank sheet of paper, preparing to show what he could do. The woman watched him closely through the inner window, hoping that he would not hit his face in the dirt. However, from the very first second that John's brush touched the paper, it became clear that these worries were in vain. The level at which he wrote was unattainable, even for the local public to understand. His own style in these places was a challenge in itself, and the ease with which he painted his work was simply amazing. But really, your own style in calligraphy is great, but it was the poetry that was judged, not the calligraphy. Meanwhile, the energy from which the boy was glowing had already reached a remarkable level, and it was far from over. The lines flew out from under his brush, one after another, more and more fascinating to everyone who saw them. And John, with a calm smile, wrote this majestic poem as if nothing had happened, paying no attention to what was happening around him. Even from the outside, it was already clear that the guy had reached the provincial level by surpassing his opponent. It really was a miracle, and to be present at the creation of such a wonderful work was happiness in itself. The poem clearly touched the most delicate strings in the souls of girls, even those who seemed to have seen everything in this world. There was not much left to write, but she realized that this poem had even more potential than it seemed. And the guy, passionate about creativity, plunged somewhere deep inside himself, producing line after line of pure genius. It was already painful to look at the guy, as he and the sheet he was writing on shone with such a bright light. So it was a near miss. John simply wrote a world-famous poem and passed it off as his own. While writing, he did not notice what was around him. But when he finished, he realized how deathly silent the room was. The silence was short-lived, however, and the crowd burst into enthusiastic cheers and shouts. It scared the guy so much that he forgot that he wanted to die and was seriously afraid that he was going to be torn to pieces. His opponent quietly approached him, looking as if the life had been drained from him. He was still impressed by John's poem and did not hide it, not knowing its true origin. Nevertheless, Young showed his best side and expressed his admiration for Kai's literary talent despite everything. His attention was diverted by the judge, who suddenly addressed him with a request. He asked for this poem, and the guy seemed not to fully understand the value of what he had just done and easily agreed. But the exam was not for the sake of attention or literature, and so the person who would bring the real reward began to approach. A girl came up to him
To read the letter and handed him an invitation from her mistress. Under the surreptitious gaze of the brothel's visitors, John, accompanied by a girl, went up to the upper rooms. People shouted congratulations on his victory in the poetry contest and showered him with praise for his skill in this field. Smiling sincerely, the boy responded with gratitude to such exclamations, but not for a second did he forget about his real purpose for visiting this place. The girl opened the door of the chamber for him, which in itself was a great honor and recognition. Behind the barely transparent curtain, only the silhouette of a woman politely greeting the boy was visible. The assistant pointed to a chair and asked Jan to sit down, and although it was phrased as a request, it was actually a peremptory condition. A woman from behind a thin curtain asked Jan to evaluate the melody. The mysterious atmosphere of this place was strangely calming. The woman's voice in the room was deep, calm, and very expressive, which made him think about her skill in her field. Meanwhile, the judge of the poetry competition clutched Jan's poem to his chest like a baby, trying to quietly leave the brothel, but failing. Having barely fought off other connoisseurs of high poetry, he was already at the exit when a gentle female voice sounded behind him. In the usual manner for this place, Lady Lu asked politely, but in fact it was an order that had to be obeyed. The judge tried to protest, but the girl resolutely suggested not to resolve this issue with her with the same polite smile. The man was reluctant to give away the poem he was holding close to his chest, but he realized that he had no choice now. Meanwhile, in the upper room, the hostess began to play the guqin, producing a complex melody filled with overtones. Listening attentively, John watched the silhouette of a woman skillfully playing a rather complicated 7-stringed instrument. Meanwhile, Miss Lu returned to the room holding the scroll with the boy's poem and gave him a piercing look. Coming closer, she asked John about his impressions of the melody her hostess was playing. In response, the guy grimaced as if he had eaten a lemon and stated in a direct and somewhat rude way that he did not like the melody at all. The women clearly did not expect such a reaction, and there was a pause filled with indignant looks and extreme surprise. Miss Lisa broke the silence by loudly criticizing the boy's taste and accusing him of being ignorant of music. In response to the accusation, Ian ironically asked what he had to say, implying that it was stupid to invite him here to avoid hearing his opinion. Without adding irony, Lisa began to explain to the guy that he should have applauded her mistress's skillful playing and not otherwise. Hearing this, the guy really thought about it, because from a technical point of view, the woman's performance was at a very high level. But despite this, the music was not catchy. It lacked something important that makes people's hearts beat faster and stop. The hostess's hands froze over the instrument. Her husband's words clearly intrigued her, though they also angered her. And really, what is the soul of music? Because it can be simple and complex, cheerful and sad, and these qualities can be set technically. But how do you give music a soul? The guy answered this question philosophically because there was no other way to describe such a purely intuitive thing. He praised the woman's technical skills, but the composition she performed was not good, and it was this disharmony that was the problem. When she asked for an assessment of the composition, her tone and face, although not visible behind the fabric, became stern and cold. Unlike her mistress, Lisa was not concerned with philosophical questions and immediately referred to the authority of the composer of this music. But in a normal discussion, a reference to authority could not be an acceptable argument, so the guy simply rejected it. The hostess had almost ceased to hide her anger and invited the guest to demonstrate what he meant by practice. I didn't realize that he was almost there because he managed to make the woman angry, which meant his life was in danger. The guy easily agreed to demonstrate his skills, but at the same time he set a condition that can only be described as insolent. The woman's tone grew colder and colder, but she agreed to the terms, but rather because it was a challenge. The guy sat down at the instrument and after a modest remark about his level of playing, decided to repeat the same trick he used in the poetry competition. But as soon as he started playing, all thoughts of his goal to die and the woman's intention to kill him flew out of his head. He loved music, listening and playing it, loved the pleasure it gave him in moments of sadness and joy. It was a genuine feeling that was instantly transmitted to everyone who had even a drop of musical ear. And so, having gotten used to the unfamiliar instrument, Jan's soul dissolved into the air around him with soft, gentle sounds. Music was transformed into images and moods that penetrated the minds of other people, conquering their emotions with its amazing power. As the guy said, it didn't matter how skillfully the person played, it didn't matter how complicated the composition was. In music, the emotions invested in the game and their harmony with the emotions invested in the composition were important. Yes, music is a flexible art. Sometimes the same composition can be played in thousands of ways, but only a few of them can have true harmony. And it was this harmony that Jan demonstrated with his playing, although his skills may not have been as well honed as the woman's. But he had a knack for understanding balance. The guy continued to play with more and more heat and accelerating the pace of the game. And suddenly, putting his palm on the strings, he muffled them, abruptly cutting off the melody without finishing it. The hostess looked up at him and asked him in surprise why he had stopped playing because she wanted to prolong this pleasure. The guy just smiled at the silhouette of a woman who had completely forgotten that he was playing to prove his point and win the bet. For a few seconds, she expected him to continue playing, but gradually she realized that her shout had confirmed his victory. She bowed low to admit defeat, even though she didn't like losing and now had to fulfill the terms of their agreement. Meanwhile, Yang stood up from the table with the instrument with a pleased face, combining this movement with a bow in return. He was even more impudent when he asked me to open the curtains, but he felt it was the right decision. Although Lisa was outraged by this behavior, she obeyed her mistress's order and opened the eyes of the impudent woman to her mistress's Ford. She really was extremely beautiful with beautiful skin and a slender frame with an extremely sweet smile. John remembered the essence of his mission and triumphed because such a wonderful girl could not be alone. And she was thinking in a completely different direction. This man was really starting to like her both internally and externally. And while the girl was thinking about conquering this handsome man, he was thinking about being killed by her suitor. Evening had fallen in the brothel of the breath of spring, but no one was going to leave. The girl was asking John about the music he was playing, and he had to come up with a good excuse for his little fraud. They were sitting at a table full of various delicacies, surrounded by beautiful paintings, but the atmosphere was really relaxed. When she asked him to show her the sheet music, she leaned so close to him that he lost the ability to think and blurted out the first thing that came to mind. He offered her a drink to somehow get rid of the unpleasant residue of his lie. Meanwhile, she was thinking about the Emperor's task. It was time to get started, and she decided to resort to a time-honored and generationally proven method of seduction. And faking a loss of consciousness caused by an unknown illness, she began to fall right into the arms of the shocked boyfriend. She literally knocked him off his feet. But she did it so elegantly and gently, and most importantly, naturally, that he didn't even think it was her game. She looked at his face and noted with satisfaction that her plan had worked completely. Ian flushed, and whether he knew or not that it was a game, was ready to act like never before. And he reached for her with the intention of kissing her, although he must admit that he looked rather stupid while doing so. But she continued to play with him, getting him more and more excited, and right now she wanted to hear a few compliments. He did not wait long and immediately told her that she was the most beautiful woman in the world, albeit in a rather poetic way. And immediately remembering his plan, he began to push the girl's thoughts in the direction he wanted. She didn't even realize what they were talking about at first, but then thought that the guy might be afraid of the consequences. And she hastened to dispel his doubts, explaining that all this was just gossip with no real basis. Hearing this, the guy's face changed, and she did not understand why he had such a reaction to her words. His plan was bursting at the seams again, and now he was unlucky enough to be killed. He lightly pushed the girl away, moving away from her. Then, with a straight face, he stood up and, explaining that it was time for him to leave, prepared to leave the woman sitting on the floor alone. At this point, the girl thought that her task was going to hell and decided to try a different approach. She started talking nonsense about distant countries and spy games. She told him why Jan should also go into the service of her mysterious master, explaining that it was a weakness in the empire. But he pushed the girl and all her arguments away in one motion, not wanting to listen any further. He didn't rush to help her when she pretended to fall to the floor, but rather scolded her like a girl. The girl was really impressed by this turn of events, and at that moment, her respect for the guy grew immensely. But she didn't like to lose, so she decided to make one more attempt to seduce Jan. Her words seemed to envelop the room like a thick, sticky smoke from which it was impossible to hide or escape. Her suggestions became more and more tempting, painting a beautiful world of the future in which the boy would find everything he wanted and needed. And next to him will be the most beautiful woman he has ever seen and is unlikely to see again. Hoping that her words had worked, she approached him and almost whispered the last phrase. It seemed that the guys were developing from within, so much so that he was immersed in a struggle with himself. But gathering his strength, he shouted out a refusal, and his figure was illuminated by the light of a scientific aura. It seemed that this shout took the last of his strength, and he was unable to even get to his feet. The woman, meanwhile, could not believe that her spell did not work. He really refused and fought a real battle with himself on his knees in her room. But she had not yet shown all she was capable of, and was not going to stop until she had a chance to break his will. The pressure John felt from the woman was really enormous. His head was splitting and his thoughts were dizzy. But she continued to press, only increasing in strength, and despite this, the guy still managed to get to his feet. Suddenly, she quickly approached him with a dangerously aggressive gesture and a determined face. It seemed that her fingers could pierce the thick oak boards, but she suddenly stopped moving when she was only centimeters away from the boy's throat. She looked him resolutely in the eye with a sly smile, and her fingertips literally flowed with deadly energy. Although this was a rather unexpected turn of events, it was a chance to die no worse than the one the guy had planned. Trying to imitate the mannerisms of the most melodramatic actors he had seen in his life, Jan cranked the drama and pathos to the max. The woman tried to talk to him as an intelligent, experienced person who was saving his own life, but obviously this approach failed in this case. The approaches and techniques that worked well for many other people simply did not work on these strange guys. His willingness to die was completely at odds with her fairly stable picture of the world. She had never really met anyone like him in her life. Paying no attention to the mortal danger to himself, instead of worrying about his life, he began to philosophize about it. I also decided to give her some advice, continuing to talk about honor, dignity, and the meaninglessness of the path of betrayal. And he continued to say that the empire is much stronger than it seems, and that the current difficulties will only make it more majestic. The guy's dramatic approach and pretentious quotes broke the girl's will, and she just froze looking at him. But the pause dragged on, and something had to be said, so she looked down in thought, looking for a way to end this conversation. And when she explained her decision to publicly refuse to kill the guy right now, she looked devastated. But still, at the last moment, she decided that one last little attempt to subdue him would not hurt and told him about the poison. With these words, she made a strange movement that made John feel as if he were standing in front of a storm. A strange wind pushed him out of the room and slammed the door in his face. The guy aptly noted that the girl was clearly not suitable for a spy because she made a number of key mistakes and did not understand which had not yet been exposed. But with a smile, he started walking away, not wanting to take part in spy games on one side or the other. He had a really satisfied face when he came downstairs, which was interpreted by the crowd in their own way. Meanwhile, alone, the girl read the poem written by Jan once again, shedding tears of sadness and happiness from the emotions these beautiful words evoked. The guy walked home in a great mood along the sun-drenched streets, while the woman thought about him and his role in this world. And the comparisons of the boy's fate and her own came naturally, comparing what he could do and what she was capable of. And that's when she decided that she would defend this person who had shown her high ideals and loyalty to them. Later, in the imperial palace, she showed Yang's poem to the emperor before reporting on the exam. She spoke laconically, but without trying to hide the details, about her attempts to seduce, threaten, and bribe the boy. And with great pleasure, she told us in more detail about how he bravely resisted all her attempts. When she finished her story, the woman bowed low before the emperor to give weight to her next request. She believed that John was not suitable for their plans precisely because of his unscrupulousness and unshakability. She understood what the emperor wanted, but she also understood that the boy could be born into great danger if he became part of his plans. And the emperor was determined and promised to protect the boy's life at any cost.
Meanwhile, the subject of their conversation was celebrating his impending death by drinking and dancing in his garden. But 3 days passed, and there was no effect of the poison. Devastated and angry, the boy came back to the house of the spring wind. He burst into the hostess's room demanding explanations and outraged that he was still alive. The woman was sitting quietly at the table with an instrument, playing a light melody, and without taking her eyes off the table, she quietly answered, reminding the boy of his own words. And after finishing the melody, she began to explain, or rather invent, what she had done after their meeting with an innocent look. Spy games and his wife's relationship with the Empire were the last thing on his mind. The first question for him was why he was still alive. With a sly smile and hands to the side, the woman simply replied that there had never been any poison. It turned out that all these 3 days, he had been hoping in vain for a death that would bring him rebirth in another world. Nothing drives a person into depression like dashed hopes, and to say that he was disappointed is an understatement. And his disappointment was especially with the woman who had deceived him so easily and showed no remorse for it. Therefore, the only thing he was capable of doing at the moment was walking around like a zombie and muttering curses in the direction of the brothel. The master's behavior confused the servant Jan. At first he walked around sad, then he was cheerful for 3 days, then sad again. And it was not good. And he answered his questions only by continuing to mutter about some lying lady. The servant even thought
that his master might have been the victim of some mystical fox, as they said that such things often happened in the past. And the woman who insulted the poor guy by not poisoning him continued to go about her usual business. But now, every time she sat down to a kixiaking, she would involuntarily think of the strange man who had not succumbed to her charms. She recalled the face of the master composer when she showed him the sheet music in which she tried to write down the melody that John played from memory. She really admired the plays he played and the poems he wrote, but it was something else that really fascinated her about him. Obviously, his heart was far from the fine arts, but his dedication and ideals were truly amazing and unique. Finally, the woman finished playing and, distracted from her philosophical reflections, decided to get down to business. Yet, it was not kixiang and poetry that were the real passion of this amazing woman, but espionage and covert operations. Meanwhile, the imperial palace gave its amazing life full of hidden secrets and false gloss. John could not understand how his strange luck worked, how his follies turned into heroic deeds, and how his words made spies surrender to the authorities. He was distracted from these thoughts by George, who was waving happily at him from the crowd of bureaucrats. Ian greeted him politely, noting that the man was now wearing a different uniform and in the imperial palace that had to mean something. Indeed, George immediately told us that his position had changed. And apparently, it was good news for him. The guy hurried to be happy for the man and warmly greeted him, although in his own somewhat inappropriate way. George liked the fact that the young official did not turn up his nose and ignore the fact that he was a grandson, as almost all other bureaucrats did. In the palace, eunuchs had their advantages, although they were disliked by other people, and although John didn't know it, he had enlisted the support of one of them today. A strange, sudden chill ran down the boy's spine as he went on about his business. The suspicious feeling of some kind of approaching disaster did not let go of John's consciousness, but this was actually for the best for him. Meanwhile, bureaucratic work continued in the throne room, with officials of all stripes standing before the emperor. The next official stood on a special spot from which to address the emperor and began a speech about a flood in one of the provinces. The emperor, looking extremely tired and bored, habitually refused to fund the project for a really banal reason. The next official began to talk about the unworthy behavior of one of the highborn. The emperor, who was about to fall asleep in his seat, habitually began to talk about the lack of money, but caught himself in time. Still, the case was trivial enough that the emperor issued another standard dictum almost automatically. When Jan heard about the incident with the Marquis's son, he could not help but say some unpleasant things in his voice, and George immediately began to shout at him. The emperor looked at Jan and thought about all these cases that had been considered today in a very pessimistic way. But the Emperor-Empress could not act otherwise. Everything was according to a plan in which everything had to be played out like a musical note. Meanwhile, the official who was reading out the imperial decrees suddenly said his name to the boy's surprise. Not knowing what to expect from this new assignment, the guy froze in place like a frightened rabbit. Meanwhile, the details of his appointment were explained, where exactly he would serve and in what capacity, sounding quite formidable. I had no idea what this appointment was really about, because it was according to the Emperor's secret plan. After receiving the papers, Ian turned around and saw a bunch of angry and dissatisfied looks from his colleagues. George decided to explain to the guy why other officials were treating his new appointment so differently. It was all about corruption. It was essentially the Ministry of Anti-Corruption, but at the moment it was acting in a haphazard manner, and many people were happy with that. In addition, this position was one of those of interest to immortal clans, which meant even more danger for the guy. Hearing about the danger, Jan's face became joyful as it brought his plan closer to fruition. He has already had some thoughts about his next steps in his new position, and judging by the twinkle in his eye, corrupt officials will have a fun life. However, the reality is somewhat disappointing. When Jan got to his new job, he found it devastated and deserted. Indeed, no one was there. The empty, cold rooms echoed, and piles of cobwebs explained that it had been like this for a long time. The guy couldn't figure out where everyone had gone, what was going on, and why the UN control was empty. He stood in front of the control gate and did not know what to do next. There was no one inside, and it would be strange to go home. The old man who helped me was a passerby, and from his short answer, it appeared that the control itself would have been worthwhile. Young did not expect that the UN control would be such an organization and did not understand why he was sent here. All this was a clear problem because the essence of the plan was to work too well. Otherwise, there would be no danger. It started snowing, and he felt a rather strange sensation, or rather, the absence of it. He was not cold. This chai energy was a really strange thing that seemed to protect him from almost all dangers, including illness and sudden attacks. As he was walking home, he saw one of his neighbors trying to get a vagrant into his house. The neighbors explained where the girl came from and were quite right to fear for her life, as it was getting colder outside every minute. The neighbor decided to shift the responsibility to Jan and did so quite persistently and convincingly. However, there were some aspects of this society that did not allow a normal, decent man to have maidservants. So Ian decided to do the smart thing and ask the girl herself first, but there were some difficulties. A mute, vagrant girl freezes in the middle of the street, while his neighbor keeps talking about his own, seeing only benefits. But still, something had to be done with the girl, otherwise she was sure to die before morning. The alternative was obvious and came to mind almost immediately. If she can't speak, maybe she can write. That's how he learned her name, and she also wrote that she was not against it, or rather, very much in favor of going to serve with him. When I got inside, I didn't want to find out the girl's story first. She described her sad story in some detail. The guy once again thought how cruel the world around him was, full of such sad, tragic stories. After carefully weighing everything, he decided that the girl would never freeze to death outside his house, but he would never make her a slave either. She feels grateful to him for bowing, which he was actually uncomfortable with because it enhanced human dignity, but instead sent her to eat and wash. It was the right decision to take the girl into the house as the snowstorm was getting worse and worse. I couldn't decide what to do with my new job, whether to file a complaint or try to figure it out on my own. His difficult reflections were interrupted by the arrival of a servant who brought Julia, who had had time to wash, eat, and rest. An unfamiliar girl stood in the doorway of the house and smiled sweetly, obviously happy, calm, and grateful. They were two completely different girls, completely different from each other. This pretty young woman was completely different from the vagrant who had left the room an hour earlier. And then the guy was surprised by a servant who, for some reason, decided that he could now rest and not pay attention to anything. And without waiting for an answer, he ran away as fast as he could, as if he were being chased by devils. Obviously, he still misunderstood the guy's intentions towards this girl. And the girl was still standing in the doorway, not knowing what to do and just blinking her huge eyes. In any case, he decided not to deal with the question of the girl's status today, so he suggested that she rest. She approached the only bed in the room uncertainly and stood looking at it for a moment. Then, cautiously and uncertainly, he clearly felt out of place. She blushed because she realized that she would not like one of the possible scenarios. Ian came over and looked at the girl for a second, who was lying there with her eyes squeezed shut. Then he took one of the pillows and wished her good night and went to sleep somewhere else. The girl stayed up all night thinking about today and its events, as well as about John's behavior. It seemed that this man was really who he was. He showed himself from the best side. Her owners were not mistaken, and she was indeed a person for whom one could give their life without a doubt, and she decided for herself that she would do so if necessary. No matter how powerful the imperial official was, he slept like an ordinary person, snoring and drooling. He was distracted from this important work by yesterday's tramp, and today he is no longer asked to work by Julia, the maid. She handed him a wet towel through the window so he could wash himself without getting out of bed. However, she was quite persistent and did not seem to respond to the boy's weak protests at all. Today he was planning to go back to his new workplace and try to restore some order there himself. There was nothing for the girl to do there, and in fact, she would only get in the way, so he decided to leave her at home. When he told her that he was not going to take her with him, she was visibly sad, stopped smiling, and looked down. John did not have any plan for what to do with this ministry, nor did he understand what to do with its other officials. But it was critical because it would have taken too long to follow their example and hope to die of excess alcohol with his new chai. A man in ministerial clothes was standing at the gate of the Yuan control, which was clearly a good sign, and the boy hurried over to him. The official turned out to be Alan Tsai, who was looking at the control gate with almost the same eyes as John's yesterday. John was glad to see a man he knew very little of, but for some reason he felt friendly toward him as if they had known each other for years. Alan responded to the boy's friendly tease quite seriously, but without offense. It was clear that he wanted to surpass John's poetry, but he wanted to do it honestly. But still, their words were characterized by the friendliness and warmth so typical of people who have gone through similar trials in their lives. Having finished with the formal greetings, I decided to find out why the man had come to this godforsaken place. It turned out that Alan himself did not expect to be appointed here and would have preferred a completely different position. But an appointment is an appointment. This was strange for John because at the moment the Yuan control was nothing more than a place of exile, and it was unclear what the boy had done to deserve it. His talents were developing in a completely different direction, and it was clear that Alan was not at all suitable for this job, although he would do it as best he could. The guy did his best to cheer up his unexpected colleague. Somewhere in another part of the city, the emperor sneezed at such a brazen reference. It was her decision to send the poet to help John, as she believed that the two were quite similar, including their purity. She believed that they would help each other and cover each other if there was any danger. But Alan was still dissatisfied. He believed that his talents had a completely different purpose in a completely different place. Ian took a more philosophical view, believing that any place would suit any person as long as they did not lose hope and purpose. And the way he explained it, clearly quoting someone, made a great impression on Alan's poetic soul. Once again, he thought that he still had a lot to learn and hone his talent to reach this level. He bowed respectfully to the boy and expressed his full agreement with his words and reminded him of the event tomorrow. John had absolutely no idea what we were talking about, but Alan quickly explained everything. It was a great opportunity, and the guy did not want to miss it, so he asked us to help him with his work as his senior. Their colleagues went about their usual business, eating, drinking, and having fun in a brothel. But today, willy-nilly, they started discussing the identity of their new colleague, or rather, the sharp contrast between their reputations. Their opinions on this were divided because reputation was not something that could be touched or measured. In addition, the Yuan control was a place of exile that had been sucking the soul out of everyone who came here for many years, turning once ambitious and honest officials into lazy, incapable drunks. One of them took the biggest cup of alcohol and started drinking as if it were the last time. And falling to the floor from a complex mixture of feelings that included fear, resentment, and trampled purity, he shouted the ironic motto of control. None of the Trinity really believed that one person, no matter how impressive his talents, could not change the situation in this ministry. Julia looked at her new master and thought about what she had been told when she was sent on this assignment. And although she didn't believe these stories, it turned out to be much worse. I was really a very strange person. She could not understand his motivations or his actions at all, and it was simply impossible to predict what would happen to him tomorrow or the next day. Right now, for example, he's been fiddling with some pots of herbs in the kitchen for most of the day. And then, looking triumphant, he carried a glass with some incomprehensible substance to Julia. Blushing, she tentatively licked the substance, trying to figure out if it was some kind of a cruel joke. The substance turned out to be sugar, and the Lord of the South spent a day making sugar, even though there was clearly no need for it. Moreover, he decided to give her the portion that he did, so it turned out that the respected official killed half a day to please the maid. Moreover, he ordered me to eat it and come back when it was over, which did not fit into the normal behavior of a bureaucrat. This behavior was dictated only and only by the normal human relationship to another human being. But in the world he found himself in, People were still not equal, and this attitude was strange and unexpected. But the sugar really turned out to be a delicious, sweet, and extremely pleasant gift. Julia tried to do as much as she could for her master, even though he was clearly uncomfortable with it. He talked about strange things and seemed to be joking rather than serious, although one could expect anything from this man. Code Julia had been briefed and told that the guy was ready to give his life for his beliefs, but she imagined it a little differently. It was also her duty to give her life if necessary, but she wanted to live and, if possible, would like to avoid death in order to serve further. She decided that this was an even higher manifestation of the same feeling she had in her soul, and so she became even more respectful of her host. And she repeated to herself that she would save his life at any cost, even if that cost was her own. And by the way, today was going to be a really dangerous day for him, so she was obliged to accompany him. As much as she could not speak, she resorted to other tactics to get John to take her with him. Her big eyes were a great help. He seems to have understood her unspoken request correctly and began to dissuade her from it. But he clearly underestimated her power of persuasion and perseverance, so she just hung on his arm. In the end, he had no choice but to admit defeat in this strange dispute. When they approached the Yuan control, they saw that Alan was already raging and loudly lecturing someone. He did not notice their arrival and continued to shout at someone as if he were the personification of morality and virtue. I decided not to show myself at once, but first to look at the objects of my friend's shout and their reaction to them. Meanwhile, the first poet of justice personified continued to rage, telling the three men about their unworthy behavior. Ian and Julia, trying not to give themselves away,
watched this scene with interest, studying the type of colleagues. In fact, Alan was shouting for a reason. Bureaucrats, wherever they are, should be on duty and not turning it into a party. But his colleagues just waved him away as if he were an annoying dog, and when that didn't work, they tried to drag him to their place. Alan's shouts did not help, but the reaction to them showed Jan something important. These people were not evil, rather they had simply lost their will. And suddenly Jan noticed that they were not the only ones watching this action. A man joined them in observing. When he saw that he had been noticed, he waved to them in a friendly, though somewhat uncertain manner, trying to be quiet. In response, Ian gestured for the man to come to the control room, not forgetting to smile politely at the same time. The man did so, and after passing the gate, he began to attract attention with a somewhat embarrassed look. But the audience, hearing this appeal, looked at the petitioner with anger. The man did not understand why he deserved such angry looks, but such a reception would make anyone uncomfortable. However, to his credit, he pulled himself together and said what he wanted to say. With a lively look, one of the men told the petitioner to take his complaints elsewhere, as no one would help him here. But Alan had already approached the man and asked him more kindly to tell him what exactly had brought him to this place. Jan and the girl continued to watch unobtrusively as Alan accepted the complaint and other officials reacted. It turned out that this place was the old man's last hope, as he had already applied to other places and was rejected everywhere. And he asked about other places where he could have received help, but it turned out that he had been there too. The reason turned out to be banal. The person who stole his coal was subordinate to a highly respected person, and no one wanted to mess with them. He admitted that anyone would be afraid to deal with the Marquis, and the poet's face began to show confusion. Meanwhile, the old man fell to his knees, begging Alan for help. It was really his last chance, and he didn't want to lose it. The boy, like John, did not like such blasphemy against human dignity and began to lift the old man. But he was pushed aside by one of the officials with a bare blade in his hand. And pointing his sword in the old man's face, he ordered him to get out in a terrible and harsh voice. He threatened him with death if he continued to kneel here and talk about his coal. John decided that this was the moment to step forward and stand up for the old man. Julia correctly read her master's mood and ran to the old man to help him up. Holding the blade for a moment, the brazen man put it behind his back, trying to turn it into a joke. However, John's face made it clear that it would not end that way, and he approached him with a clearly aggressive intent. And the next moment,
he rewarded the insolent with a strong and unexpected slap. And when he started shouting at him, he continued to stand there motionlessly looking at him. But the very next moment, without listening to the sentence to the end, he rewarded the impudent man with another slap. And he continued to beat him in this way, despite his cries and the sword in his hand. But the man was already boiling with anger and swung his blade at the Yun with the clear intention of cutting him almost in half. However, he did not dare, and at the last second stopped a few centimeters from the guy's neck. He clearly did not know how to assess the situation, as he decided to start threatening only after that. And maybe it would even work for someone else, but he was dealing with Jan, who was actually trying to die as soon as possible. He even began to show me exactly where it would be most convenient to make his head. The guy had never seen anything like this in his life. Usually, people would compromise and try to make peace out of fear of death. This one just stood there smiling right in his face and generally for his own life. He thought that Jan would be afraid and retreat, but now he had to retreat, but in a way that would not lose face. It was a really reasonable reason for not killing, no matter how ridiculous it may sound. When he took off his ritual clothes, Jan simply turned into a man without a title or rank, so the excuse did not work. Jan took the man at face value, hoping that he would eventually lose his nerve and cut him down with his sword. But he had obviously already lost all the enthusiasm that probably never existed at all, but continued to find excuses for himself. However, his words about a simple peasant had the opposite effect to what was expected, and the guy attacked him even more furiously. Holding him by the tanks, he simply dragged him somewhere, under the stunned glances of everyone present. He pulled him to a wall with the mottos of their service written on it, which the man had obviously forgotten long ago. He kept telling our boy off for not learning his lesson at school. Senyaki refigured Yang as he spoke these 20 magical and power-filled words. The words resonated with the very air around them, causing flashes of chi energy and echoing around. The energy swirled and formed a ball of lightning and crashed right into the chest of the arrogant official. The energy layer that had hit him seemed to dissolve in the man's body, and a strange, long-forgotten feeling began to grow in his soul. Other officials looked on in amazement and disbelief because it is no exaggeration to say that they had witnessed a miracle. Alan, who had already seen the boy's talents during a poetry tournament, put into words what each of them was thinking. Still, the years of inactivity did not pass in vain, and the brazen official wanted to feel wrong, but he could not stop so easily. And the problem with the old man and his coal still had no solution. The highborn marquis could not be so easily pressured by force, and no one would help them solve this case. However, the boy did not seem to hear him, and in response simply went to the girl holding his cape. And pulling it on with a determined look, he said that he was going to do what he had to do anyway. It was a real challenge that surprised all those present, who could not have imagined such a turn. Although Alan was wholeheartedly on Jan's side, he could not just let him go on this adventure. As a warning, he told a story about the Marquis that frightened everyone else. According to it, the Marquis dealt with his enemies in the most brutal way. And even the Emperor himself did not want to get involved with this cruel, vengeful man. John did not pay any attention to this, although it was extremely surprising to everyone, but it was exactly the kind of situation he was looking for. Thinking that the guy simply did not understand the meaning of what was said, the other official said it as bluntly as possible. The guy made it clear that he absolutely understood the situation, but that it was his duty, and hinted that it was not only his. And he made it clear that the control of the Yuan is not just a place where the leaders grill kebabs, it is a symbol of justice and order in the empire. He explained to the impudent official that he had no purpose or reason to live and was no more than a simple animal. He added that only weak people will avoid strong opponents by hinting not so much at themselves as at them. John's words confused the souls of officials who were once good people who wanted to do good, although they had forgotten about it. But remembering it was painful and unpleasant because it meant accepting the real me without excuses or fantasies. A minute later, the official with the sword ran out to catch up with the determinedly walking John. He overcame himself and decided to join the boy in his noble mission, and his friend also made the same decision. A third official shouted after them, obviously unwilling to die so heroically for a peasant. But after standing for a second and thinking about everything that had just happened, he exhaled heavily and made a decision. Throwing some incomprehensible box behind his back, he followed them. Maybe he didn't want to die for a peasant, but friends are friends. And he looked at his new companions over his shoulder, not understanding why he knew the names they finally gave him. Passers-by looked at this procession in amazement because they had never seen the entire Yuan control board go anywhere other than a brothel. Many people thought that this ministry had ceased to exist long ago. And under the gaze of the amazed public, the full composition of the Yuan control approached the Marquise's residence. As he got closer, Ian turned to Julia to send her away because now her life could be in danger, which he did not want. She remembered his behavior and the words he had said this morning. And finally, the puzzle of his behavior was formed in her mind. He died a martyr's death for the sake of the high ideals of morality, justice, and equality. And this touched her to the very depths of her soul. She held his hand and thought about the cases when one such person could save hundreds and thousands of others. She thought that under no circumstances could she let him die. Meanwhile, one of the officials reported to the emperor about what was happening with the control of the Yuan. And since this was the place where the emperor was hiding an important person, the reaction was immediate. With a wave of his hand, the emperor channeled his energy and a magical ball hung in the air. with the help of which he could watch events that were far away from him. Officials stood in front of the gate to the Marquis's residence, either gathering their courage or thinking about strategy. Jan noticed that the hammers on the gate were gold, which did not meet the standards of modesty that a high-born Marquis should have shown. Alan reached for one of them to knock, even though he felt incredibly scared.